Well, thank you, Chris, and welcome, Michael. It's a pleasure to see you again.
You too. Thank you very much for having me.
Michael and I go back a few years. We met on the occasion of the World Athletics, well, then IAAF World Half Marathon Championships in Valencia, where Michael did the keynote speech, actually. It was about the same type of research that we're going to talk today, except that in this 4 years, the research has morphed into a best-selling book, Out of Thin Air, Running, Wisdom and Magic from Above the Clouds in Ethiopia. Michael, the book is great, but let's first talk about you. Who are you?
So I'm a social anthropologist based in Durham at Durham University. I spent 15 months basically in Ethiopia researching the book, but it was for a PhD project that I was doing initially. But I guess my relationship with running goes back a lot further than that. I've been running competitively since I was about 14, so I guess more than half of my life at this stage. So the book is kind of also sort of responds to that as well, I guess.
And it's called Out of Thin Air. Why is that?
It's called Out of Thin Air for two reasons, really. The first one is that obviously we have this idea that a lot of the success of East African runners is because of the altitude that they're born and live at. But also, I think it's sort of a play on this idea that we think that Ethiopian and Kenyan runners sort of just appear out of thin air as if from nowhere, that we don't really know that much about them. And so that was kind of what motivated me really to write the book. I wanted to write something that kind of brought the stories of Ethiopian runners at a variety of different levels of the sport to life, and tried to sort of explain how the world looks from their perspective a little bit more than has been done in the past, basically.
No, fascinating. Certainly, if you read the book and see the amount of work that they put into, you will understand that they do not come out of thin air. Michael, Ethiopia is a huge country, 115 million population, and one of the fastest growing countries on planet Earth right now. Approximately, this is probably not the specificity of your research, but approximately, how many people are making a living from the sport? What would you say for the sport of distance running?
I think probably some running sort of consistently in international races. I think probably somewhere between 500 and 1,000. Maybe a few more than 1,000, but not that many more. I wouldn't have thought. I'm not 100% sure, I should say, but it's quite a small fraction of the number of people who are actually sort of engaged in running in Ethiopia. I think who are actually making it.
Okay, and what would that number be then? That broader number of people engaged in running in Ethiopia?
Broader number, running competitively, I would have thought. Not 100% sure, but at least in sort of 10,000, something like that, I would have thought. Because I think one of the things people, the stereotypes of East African running often are of people running sort of barefoot to and from school, and sort of becoming good athletes that way, sort of outside of any kind of institutional structure, I guess. And so one of the things that kind of surprised me a little bit in Ethiopia was that there's this huge amount of institutional support actually for athletics, a load of different levels. So you've got athletics in schools, but then you've got loads and loads of regional training camps all around Amhara region and Oromia. And so there's a huge number of people who are actually just sort of supported to run more or less full time. So from quite a young age, so teenagers up into to sort of early 20s, where people are sort of given somewhere to live, given a structure where they can just focus on their athletics. And that the number of people for whom that is true is probably at least in the thousands. Yeah.
And if you take these 500 to 1,000 Ethiopians who made it to the big time, to the big city marathons worldwide, for each of them who makes it, how many don't?
I would say a good at least 100, I would have thought.
Okay, so we really are seeing the top of...
And more than that, if you count the people who sort of have a go at running for just a few months, I saw that in Addis. One of the things that was interesting was that I would just go running, in the forest above where I lived, and you'd have people from basically people who were construction workers or had some sort of manual job in Addis, who just had kind of seen runners and were interested and therefore had gone to the forest and started training, all the way through to people like Jamal Yima, who I write about in the book, who's the Ethiopian record holder for the half marathon. So all of the forests have that kind of people from all different levels, including people who are just sort of giving it a go for a short amount of time. But even those people, I think, that who are just getting started in the sport, they have this aspiration and this idea in the back of their minds that maybe one day they'll become as successful as someone like Jamal. There isn't so much of a culture of just kind of mass participation running in Ethiopia, apart from for the Great Ethiopian Run. I wouldn't have thought at this stage.
Now, a broad question, and you can give me the answer to the angle you prefer. What motivates them?
So what everybody basically said was that they were running to change their lives. And that meant that, broadly speaking, people were motivated by economic motivations. Basically, people said, I want to be able to support my family. I want to be able to get married, build a house, be able to support myself after my running career is finished. So that was the main motivation. But I do think that people, I was writing about this the other day in an article. I think the reason that Ethiopia had so much more success on the track in the world indoors than Kenya is probably because people still have this real sense of wanting to do well on the track. And I think that's, whilst there's a little bit less money, obviously, in track running at the moment, I think people still have this sense that track running is important because of its kind of the history of track running in Ethiopia with Haile Gebrselassie and Bekele and people like that. So I think there's also this sense of kind of national pride and wanting to do something that that reflects well on Ethiopia as well.
And well, in the book, a big chunk of the book is you describing basically the daily lives of these athletes from the inside. You've been training with them, living with them, eating with them. I hope you don't mind if I say that most of the times they were running ahead of you, given how talented they are. Even though, Michael, you are no amateur athlete, you're no recreational athlete yourself. You also have some quite good performances under your name. What would their average day look like?
So we would get up 3 days a week at about 4:30 in the morning in order to take a bus that took us basically outside of Addis Ababa to training locations around the city. And that was because people believed really strongly in this idea that you needed to kind of harness different environmental resources in order to do well. So people would like to go to Toto sometimes at really high altitude, sort of 3,000 meters above sea level, to do slow runs. And then other days we would take a bus down to somewhere called Akaki, which is much, much warmer, more like 2,000 meters above sea level. And we'd go down there to do the kind of fast speed sessions. So there was this idea that it was important to move around to get not only access to different altitudes, but also different kind of temperatures of running environments and different surfaces underfoot. So those days we'd get up at 4:30. We sometimes wouldn't get back home until midday because we'd sit in traffic all the way back into Addis Ababa afterwards. Then people would generally sort of eat lunch, then kind of sleep for a decent part of the afternoon, and then do another training session about 4:30 in the afternoon, which would be more kind of slow jogging to recuperate from the morning session. And then on days when we didn't take the bus anywhere, we would train usually twice a day as well, but have a lie-in until about 5:30 in the morning in order to start running when the sun came up basically at 6. But on those days we would train, I lived in Kotebe, which is a suburb of Addis, and we would just walk from there into the forests, Yaka sub-city forests, where you can run in the kind of between the eucalyptus trees, basically all the way up into the mountains from there. So that would be, and then mostly Sundays tended not to train on a Sunday for religious reasons. So we normally train 6 days a week. Like
6 days a week, twice a day.
Yeah.
Michael, this webinar today is about running in the city, and one may wonder why we're having you. Well, but my thought process was, in Ethiopia, differently from Kenya, it's often reported that athletes prefer to live in big cities as opposed to camps in the countryside, in the mountains, on the hills, because there is a sense that they can get more opportunities there. Is it because of habit? Is it because of the way this support structure works? Why do Ethiopian athletes prefer living in big cities?
Yeah, you're right. I mean, basically all of the top athletes in Ethiopia live in Addis. And that's, yeah, basically just because that's where the opportunities are with managers. So the general trajectory of an athlete would be to start off in a rural training camp somewhere. Most of the runners that I knew were from up in the north of Ethiopia in kind of Gondar region.
Mm-hmm.
And if they did well from the local training camp, they would then go to a regional training camp, which was usually a bit closer to Addis. And then eventually the sort of end game of the process is to end up in Addis Ababa, working with a manager in order to be able to access races abroad. It's very much more difficult than in Kenya, I think, to live somewhere more rural and still get access to races, which is in many ways a bit of a shame, because people did say that living in Addis is something of a compromise, really. It's not necessarily the best place to train because it's quite busy, it's noisy, you've got to go in the bus to get to training, it's expensive. So I'm kind of in some ways surprised that there isn't a center a bit more like Iten in Ethiopia, because Bakoji is where a lot of the runners come from, and I write about Bakoji in the book. It's where Kenenisa Bekele and Tirunesh Dibaba are from. That could become a hub, I guess, of where there's more kind of managers and people involved sort of directly in Bakoji, but it seems like the trend in Ethiopia has just been for everybody to move to the city, basically. And go
city with 17,000 people, which has produced how many world champions and record holders? It's pretty incredible.
I think it was 17 last time I counted, but it's probably gone up since then.
Okay. You mentioned managers. Now, in World Athletic jargon, we call them AR, athlete representatives, and they are part of the support structure that basically scouts, nurtures, and brings Ethiopian athletes to the world stage. Can you tell us more about that? Because we often hear when we work with these managers that they have sub-agents in Ethiopia. How that support structure work?
Yeah. So yeah, as I said before, most athletes come through the training camps and end up in Addis. Normally, when they arrive, they do so because they've got a contract to run for one of the first division clubs in Ethiopia, which is basically like the sort of Premier League of running clubs in the country. So most of those are sponsored by entities like the Ethiopian Commercial Bank or the cement factory or the army or the police. And so those clubs pay people a salary that's enough to live off in a month, to pay their rent and things. They normally give them somewhere where they can go for meals as well. So I knew a lot of runners from a club called Merbrat Heil, which is the electric corporation, and they would be able to go to the electricity corporation to have lunch with the workers there and things. So there's this whole structure of club running,
like in Japan.
Like in Japan. So yes, exactly. So there's a structure of club running, and the clubs take this. It's a really serious business for the clubs, because they sponsor, they sort of employ athletes or have running teams in order to kind of increase their own prestige. And so the athletes are expected to run a certain number of races domestically in Addis for the club every year. And then on top of that structure, you have the managers who are, or athlete representatives, as you say, who are primarily European or American, and who basically arrange races abroad for athletes. So organize visas, organize flights, organize the terms of the contracts with races. But most of those managers are not in Ethiopia for very many weeks of the year, basically. So you have, really it's the sub-agents who are primarily Ethiopian, who are on the ground, who do a lot of the decision making about which athletes will go to races and things like that. So their role is really crucial. And I kind of got to know that role really well, because I lived in a compound when I was doing my fieldwork with a sub-agent of Moyo Sports Management. So I was able to really learn about his role in the whole process, which was basically everything from being the kind of confidant of the athletes, working out what kind of races they wanted to run, trying to work out what made them tick, and liaising between them and the coaches and the manager, and then also accompanying them to kind of visa interviews, going to embassies, making sure they got to the airport on time, all these kinds of things. So they have I think the sub-agents have this really, really important role to play in all this. But yeah, the managers sit on top of that, basically organizing negotiating with the races and things.
Michael, most of the people we have online today for this webinar would be I guess, race organizers, and many of them are experienced. They've been working with with international, mainly East African elite athletes for decades. Others are new to the World Athletics label system, which is the international circuit for the sport. The system is organized in such a way that, at least in a non-COVID era, races need to have a certain level of elite competition to qualify for labels. This means that a number of race organizers have started also, thanks to a push from World Athletics, to stage world-class international competitions at home. And they might not necessarily know how to best work with these athletes. Now, knowing what you know about Ethiopian running culture and their habits and what makes them perform at the best of their ability, if you could single out for me like 3 or 4 recommendations for race organizers, for elite athletes coordinator, if I'm a race organizer, how do I put my Ethiopian athletes in the best possible condition to express their full potential?
Yeah, great question. So most of the runners that I knew were very against running on the roads, apart from in races and in very fast training sessions. So basically, if you've got a group of East African athletes in a hotel for 2 or 3 days before a race, best thing to do is to make sure you've got somewhere where they can run on grass or in a forest or somewhere that's not on a really hard surface. So that'd be the first thing. Take people somewhere, really kind of think quite carefully about where, what kind of facilities you have in order to allow people to train. The second thing I would do would be to think carefully about how you can help the athletes to communicate with the public in as direct a way as they can, because most Ethiopian athletes are quite happy to do that. And they often need a little bit of help, just because primarily they speak Amharic. They might speak some English, but often what I see is that even with athletes like someone like Solomon Barega, whose English is very good, if you ask a really kind of convoluted question in an interview, it's still going to be difficult for him to pick up exactly what you're asking him. So if I was doing that, what I would do is I would make sure I phrase the question in a way that's easy to understand, but also probably just let him know what I'm going to ask him 5 minutes before I actually record the interview. So that'd be another thing. And then I think what's possible is just to kind of liaise with the managers a little bit more around social media with athletes, because I think increasingly Ethiopian and Kenyan athletes are sort of do have Instagram and Twitter accounts and things, but they sort of often use them in conjunction with their manager, or they're mainly controlled by the manager. But people are increasingly understanding the benefits of doing that. I think that's also another thing that I think we could be doing more generally, whether it's a job of the managers or the races or who, I'm not sure, but basically trying to explain to athletes the benefits of using these kinds of things for their own careers and financially, in terms of when they're negotiating contracts with brands and things. I think often Ethiopian and Kenyan athletes don't really realize that they can make more money if they're using Instagram, and that if they're actually engaged with that. So helping athletes.
Social media, which is the biggest social media in Ethiopia? Because I guess a country of over 150 million you can definitely create a follow there for the athletes. What do they use? Yeah,
I mean, most of the athletes tend to use Facebook primarily, but a lot of the runners now are starting to use Instagram and Twitter and things as well, because they're beginning to realize that it's important for their careers. But there's not that much. I just think there could be more in the way of training for athletes, and how to use those and how to use them to their advantage. But to go back to the races specifically, I think most big cities will have an Ethiopian diaspora population as well, where you'll have people who can speak Amharic and English, or Afan Oromo in English. And I would suggest reaching out to those communities and trying to find somebody who can come and help to interpret in interviews, in order to allow people to express themselves in their own language. I think that's really important. And it's also good for I think races I've been at where there has been a diaspora population, the athletes feel much more comfortable in the environment when there's other Ethiopians around who come to, and it's a really nice connection between the elite athletes and Ethiopians who live in Istanbul, for example. When I was there, it was like there was a really nice little community of people. So I think that can really help athletes to feel comfortable, but also to be able to express themselves. And then I think, one thing that to remember about Ethiopians specifically is that people don't really like one of the worst things that you can be seen to be in Amhara culture is arrogant. So being asked to speak in a way that is very kind of self-aggrandizing in interviews can be quite difficult for people. So if you can avoid pushing people into saying things that make them feel uncomfortable as well, that can help.
In terms of food, what kind of food do I have to prepare to make sure that they feel comfortable?
Food-wise, I mean, most athletes grow up eating primarily injera, which is a kind of specifically Ethiopian kind of pancake bread made of teff flour. But then when they move to the city, they get used to eating rice and pasta and things like that. So I think I would make sure there's kind of pasta and vegetables, rice and vegetables, things like that, quite easy to digest stuff, nothing too, yeah. It's I mean, they're very used to eating spicy food, but when I was in China, people were, I think, quite keen to try to get some food that was just a little bit less likely to upset their stomachs, I guess, than what they would give. So like rice and vegetables and things. People generally avoid meat just before a race. So kind of depends, but yeah, rice and pasta. Same, I think that's probably true of all athletes around the world, right?
Michael, what about the Ethiopian names? Now, our statisticians, from time to time, they really go crazy trying to sort out who's raised where, because Ethiopian name can come in different combinations. But reading your book, I realized that it can really be simple. Tell us about that.
Yeah, it should be really simple. Basically, people have a given name, which is the name they're given when they're born. So if you take Kenenisa Bekele, his name is Kenenisa. And Bekele is his father's name, his father's given name. And then sometimes people have other names after that. And if they do, it's their grandfather's given name after that. And then so basically, the simplest way to do it is just to use the first name that you're given. So
put the first name on the bib, because Kenenisa is Kenenisa.
I would just say, yeah, it's kind of, I would just, first name on the bib would be the best way forward. But the trouble is that there's no real standard convention, it seems. So yeah, I've seen the same athlete with 3 or 4 different things on the bib at different races, which is really,
tell me about it, Michael.
It becomes difficult to build a narrative around an athlete when their name is constantly changing.
Yeah, that's another thing. Media should really be taught to do it. Specialized media have really improved when it comes to telling stories of this athlete, but all too often we see generalist media referring to the East Africans, or in some cases even the Ethiopian.
I really think that that's something that athlete representatives could be involved in a little bit more. Just basically, there's one thing that I did with Malcolm from Moyo Sports a little bit when I was working alongside him, was to just send races just a page of information about all the athletes. So, you know, where they went to school, where they're from, a couple of things that they're interested in, just the kind of colorful details that you would have for most European or American athletes. It would be very easy for athlete representatives to just put those documents together for all of their athletes, and then it helps the commentators to sort of to give those athletes a bit more of a personality. I think that would be really good.
Michael, we have to wrap up in a couple of minutes, but before we go, I really have one curiosity, one question. Now, in our Western culture, the loneliness of the long-distance runner is often mythicized. We like to think of marathoners as people who individually they battle the elements and out of willpower come out on top of challenges. Whereas reading your book, I realized that in Ethiopia things are quite different. Running is more seen as a collective endeavor, and this probably explains why often you see them saying things like "Let's work together," "Follow me." Tell us about that. How did that work?
Yeah, so people had this very strong sense that you have to be embedded in this group environment in order to improve. So success is kind of collectively produced by being in that environment. So one thing that it took me a while to get used to was that people actually, when you're running sort of fast training sessions on asphalt, for example, people will run actually in time, synchronized with each other. Yeah. Their feet will be like literally just in sync. And so people think that that's a real way of kind of sharing energy between people. So I think, it's a very different idea. Rather than thinking of energy and potential as being kind of bounded within an individual body, they think of energy as something that can be kind of shared between people. So it was very important. Everybody said, in order to be changed, in order to improve, you've got to be together in a group. So yeah, it was very, very important.
Yeah, fascinating. I read that they were pointing at their heels when running, as so as to prompt you to follow them. Literally follow my,
Yeah,
my
yeah.
footsteps, run in my footsteps.
Yeah, exactly. As soon as a little gap opened up between me and the person in front, which did happen pretty often when I got left behind, it would sort of click their finger and say, "Come on, you got to be right on my heels, and then we'll be fine."
Yeah, fascinating. Michael, we are at the, well, no longer at the beginning, in the middle of a beautiful marathon season here in the Northern Hemisphere, and we look forward to seeing many more performances from Ethiopian, but also Kenyan and other distance runners at the very many marathons part of our global calendar. Michael, thank you. Your book is available on Amazon and a number of outlets. Out of Thin Air, Running Wisdom and Magic from the Clouds in Ethiopia. Hope to cross paths soon in person, Michael. It was a pleasure
Yeah,
to
that'd
have
be
you with
great.
us today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Over to you, Chris.